Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Memetic Universe. So, today I have a special treat for you. We are going to go through something that here at Memetic Universe we consider a foundational document. Why is this a foundational document? Because I think that it illustrates so much of what we at Memetic Universe are trying to accomplish. This is a kind of like a first-hand account of the forces at play within the major media outlets at this point in our history. So I'm just doing this off the cuff, but bear with me here. Here's some context. So the document is When the New York Times Lost Its Way. This is published in 1843 magazine, but it was published after the departure of this guy, James Bennet. He ran the opinion desk at the New York Times for, for about 4 years. Yeah, so it says here, from May 2016 until his resignation in June 2020. This is just a valuable document. It's long. I'm going to post the link to the document. I'm going to, if I have time, I'm going to do a read through as well, so that you can listen to the document. But as we go through it, on the left here, I kind of copied it into numbered paragraphs in Uncle Ted style. I love the numbered paragraphs. And I made some highlights. So I'm going to give a quick summary of what this article is about, or what this essay rather is about. And then I'm just going to jump into some of the highlighted sections, discuss it. Hopefully you gain something valuable from this. So, as I said before, this was written by James Bennet after he was forced to resign from the New York Times. Okay? So, when we think about the New York Times, we usually think about the, it's the biggest newspaper, I believe, by subscribers in the United States. Yeah, you can see here it has about 8 million subscribers. That's not just print circulation. As you can see, there's a difference. I think most of these people are digital subscribers. But as far as like legacy media, old school newspapers, so legacy media that is not cable television, the New York Times is king. And they know it. They claim to, write the first draft of history and to be the newspaper of record. So when events happen, the New York Times thinks it's their job to read everything into the public record. Regardless, let's jump into the drama of why James Bennet was discussed. This is kind of the gist of the essay. He uses the events that led to his resignation as an entry point into exploring the wider problems at the New York Times and at these legacy media institutions in general. So, a brief summary. James Bennet is running the opinion desk at the New York Times, and this is supposed to be different from the news desk, although he gets into that, how news and opinion have been, the news desk is starting to run opinion pieces, so the distinction seems to be confusing. Anyways, this is about the time of the George Floyd riots in summer of 2020. They have run an article in the opinion section from, some person submitted it kind of advocating for the abolition of police. And then he's like, well, we need a differing opinion. And so Tom Cotton, senator from Arkansas, who has contributed to the New York Times before, he writes an essay on why they should deploy troops to, I guess, control the riots, and especially to prevent looting and violence. Similar to, I assume, what was done in Detroit in 1968. Regardless, that's what happens. They run he seems to get approval from the editor-in-chief and from some of the higher-ups in the newspaper to run this op-ed by Tom Cotton, and basically the staff revolts. They said that this, advocating for troops in the newspaper endangers the journalist. There's a revolt, and he's asked to resign. Okay. It takes him that rough story he explains in about 139 meaty paragraphs. So that's the gist of it. This guy is James Bennet has worked in journalism for a long time. He's an idealistic journalist running an opinion section because he was the editor of the Atlantic, which I think only ran opinion pieces. He did that for about 10 years before he went to the New York Times. So he has a lot of experience running a publication that's supposed to share opinions. He's, like, oh, I got to share differing opinions, right? I guess not. Anyways, that's enough of me talking. Let's jump into the quotes here. So, yes, he says here in the Times opinion section, which he oversaw, he was pursuing a role of presenting debate from all sides. So that's why he's getting people of different backgrounds to write things, or attempting to, in the opinion section. How about this one? Whether or not American democracy endures, a central question historians are sure to ask about this era is why America came to elect Donald Trump, promoting him from a symptom of the country's institutional, political, and social degradation to its agent-in-chief. So I highlighted this because around this section, he's describing the shift that he observed at the New York Times leading up to and after Trump's election, where everyone was just in shock. I don't know if people remember 2016, leading up to that election, people were just convinced that Hillary Clinton would win, that it was a layup. Trump wins, and everyone's shocked. They're like, how could he win? Who could support this guy, right? And so the public information professionals at places like the New York Times are kind of forced to ask the same question. How were they so convinced that, Clinton was going to win? Why did Trump win? They needed to, ask some serious questions. James Bennet, kind of in these subsequent paragraphs here, advocates for going out and talking to Trump voters and running, opinions of Trump voters or people associated with that in the opinion column to educate the New York Times readership. However, the New York Times readership, which is shifted primarily to subscriptions, don't really want to see this. He talks a little bit about illiberalism. He contrasts liberalism, like the liberal bias of the New York Times, with what he views as this illiberalism arising of just like shutting down any competing viewpoints, which he felt pressured to do in the opinion desk. So he says the relentless struggle against biases and preconceptions, rather than the achievement of a superhuman objective omniscience, is what mattered. That's what mattered to him at the opinion desk. But he really struggled to achieve that. So he talks about kind of the history of the New York Times. It's been family owned since it was created. Kind of the role that it plays. So he says, recently though, the reality is that the Times is becoming the publication through which America's progressive elite talks to itself about an America that does not really exist. Basically, like, they're not presenting a breadth of opinions. They're kind of, he thinks that the Times has been publishing content that just provides confirmation bias to the majority of their readership. He says in parts that I didn't highlight that there's a kind of a business justification for this. The Times shifted from ads to making their money primarily via subscriptions, and if people see things in the paper that they don't like, that rubs them wrong, they'll cancel their subscription. There was a notable example of this. I saw Rebecca Solnit, the notable author of the essay Men Explain Things to Me, that coined the term mansplaining. She canceled her New York Times subscription because she thought that the coverage of the Trump assassination in 2024 was too, what's the right word? Hagiographic? I don't know, like saluted. It was too generous to Trump. So she canceled her Times subscription. Long story short, he's right, right? So he's realizing, and so he wrote this, right after 2020. It was probably published sometime in 2021. So a few years ago, even, he's realizing that he kind of can't pursue this idealistic approach to journalism because he could lose subscribers by publishing things that the readers don't want to hear. And he emphasizes this in this quote. I joined the paper for my first stint in the pre-internet days in an era of American journalism so different that it was almost another profession. So, more backstory. James Bennet really kicked off his career at the Times. This is before he worked at the opinion desk. And he goes into this further down here, how he says most of the journalists, or almost all of the journalists back in the day, like in the 90s, the heyday of, not the heyday, but, a time when print journalism was dominant and viewed as a growing industry. They were all assigned to the Metro news desk. So they had to cover New York City. They had to talk to people. They had to get their elbows wet. They weren't just like propagandizing, from an ivory tower. They had to actually go and talk to real people, which he believes doesn't really happen anymore. He explains that further on, but we don't have to dig into that right now. Blah, blah, blah. He goes through his background, He really emphasizes how important he thought it was to start on the Metro news desk, talking to, as he says, old immigrants from Eastern Europe, and like young people of all different socioeconomic backgrounds. Like, he had to talk to them to get city news. This he thinks was integral to his development. He talks a bit about the Atlantic, which he worked at before. It was solely an opinion publication, right? And this is important. The Times presents itself as not as an opinion publication, right? The Atlantic is solely opinion pieces. The New York Times has a separation between the news desk and the opinion desk. This is because the news desk is supposed to be facts, not tinged by opinion. Whereas the opinion desk is where you can publish your op-eds and where people could say, this is what I think about this policy. Whereas the news desk should just be like, this policy is being written into law or whatnot. Unfortunately, this is, he observes this to start, to begin breaking down this distinction at the New York Times. So he says here, the Atlantic did not aspire to the same role as the Times. It did not promise to serve up the news of the day without any bias. But it was to opinion journalism what the Times reporting was supposed to be to news, honest and open to the world. The question was what the magazine's 19th century claim of intellectual independence, to be of no party or clique, should mean in the digital era. This is a long article. He jumps into more, but what I really want you to take away from this part is that, the Atlantic's is solely opinion. The Times is not, or is not supposed to be. But opinion reporting starts to, or opinion editing begins to creep into all aspects of the organization, not just news, or not just the opinion desk. So let's find some other good quotes here that I underlined. So he says, though the opinion department, which had about 100 staff, was a fraction the size of the newsroom, which had about 1,300, opinion's work had outsized reach. Most importantly, the Times, probably more than any other American institution, could influence the way society approached debate and engagement with opposing views. So James Bennet is aware of the power the Times has in shaping narrative, especially among America's literati. Imagine your like elite college educated crowd that have their hands on a lot of the levers of power. He's aware of how important that is, and he believes that they need to be fed, this whole class of people in America need to be fed opposing viewpoints. He will soon be proven wrong in his belief. So, when he comes to the opinion department, he says, when I looked around the opinion department, change was not what I perceived. Excellent writers and editors were doing excellent work, but the department's journalism was consumed with politics and foreign affairs in an era when readers were also fascinated by changes in technology, business, science, and culture. So, here he's saying it's not just that different opinions on politics aren't being shared, but this desire to shape a single political narrative is even overwhelming opinion coverage of other topics that may not be as much of hot button issues. He talks a little bit about how the owner of the newspaper, one of the Salzburgers, thinks there's too many liberals in the newsroom. He says you can't ignore 150 million conservative Americans. More paragraphs just ruminating on that. Let's see here. So kind of going back to the media, not the mainstream media not taking seriously the fact that Trump could become president. He circles back to this around here. So he says 2 years later, in 2020, Bakay's the editor-in-chief of the newspaper at this time, acknowledged that in 2016, the Times had failed to take seriously the idea that Trump could become president, partly because it failed to send its reporters out into America to listen to voters and understand the turmoil in the country. And he continued, the Times still did not understand the views of many Americans. This goes back to his what he wrote earlier on extensively about how important it was for reporters to start in the Metro news desk, where they had to go out and talk to New Yorkers. Not only are reporters not starting their careers by going and talking to New Yorkers, they're not even going out and talking to people in the country that they are supposed to report on and understand. This James considers an issue, but he is not rewarded for thinking that way. Blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of great information here, and I encourage you all to read it. Because of how long this is, I'm just going to selectively dig into different parts here. But these two quotes right here, I'm not going to read them, but this is kind of describing how that phenomenon of reporters starting on the Metro news desk died out. Basically, around the great financial crisis in 2008, the Times was at risk of dying. And what they did is they were like, oh, we need to pivot to digital or to new media. So they hired all of these digital and podcast producers and reporters from places like BuzzFeed and HuffPost. And that became kind of like the new cohort of the New York Times moving into the 2010s. And critically, as he says, these people who were hired in never had to work in the Metro news desk. They never had to go out and talk to people unless explicitly required to. He says that here. Critically, the Times abandoned its practice of acculturation, including those months-long assignments on Metro covering cops and crime or housing. Many new hires who never spent time in the streets went straight into senior writing and editing roles. Then he talks about Trump winning the presidency. So Trump winning the presidency actually was beneficial to the Times business. They had a huge ballooning of subscribers. He describes that here. He says that 95% of the subscribers describe themselves as Democrats or independents and self-describe themselves as liberal. So, almost their entire readership is towards this self-described political orientation that increases the pressure to give the subscribers what they want. And the editor-in-chief says that here. It became one of Dean Bakay's frequent mordant jokes that he missed the old advertising-based business model because compared with subscribers, advertisers felt so much less of a sense of ownership over their journalism. So, like, if you were just buying the Times, it's making money from ads. You're not paying, you're not a paying subscriber. You're just like, this is what's in the Times, but the Times is still making money. So it's different. This is a great article. I really encourage you to read it or listen to it. But what we're digging up here, what I'm trying to demonstrate is through this guy's essay is how things have changed, how the news has changed over time, especially since Trump was elected and especially since COVID. So this digs in. This right here digs into why the opinion, kind of like the implications of having an opinion department separate from the newsroom. So he asked this question: why did the paper still have an opinion department separate from the newsroom, with its own editor reporting directly to the publisher? If the newsroom was publishing the best opinion journalism at the paper, if it was publishing opinion at all, why did the Times maintain a separate department that falsely claimed to have a monopoly on such journalism? So this contest of control over opinion journalism within the Times was not just a bureaucratic turf battle, although that was part of it. The newsroom's embrace of opinion journalism has compromised the Times' independence, misled its readers, and fostered a culture of intolerance and conformity. The opinion department is a relic of the era when the Times enforced a line between news and opinion journalism. So I think that this is maybe the most important realization that you can have from this entire essay, right? And I didn't really realize this before reading this. I didn't realize, I'm not a Times reader, but I didn't realize that before they had this strictly enforced line between opinion and news. But now that they are allowing news to have opinion writing, they're misleading readers. They're kind of like laundering this image that they developed in the 20th century of having non-biased, news. Now that they're allowing all of that to be opinion reporting, they're laundering that reputation for being unbiased. And I'm curious how many publications made this switch. This would kind of dig into the history of newspapers, but I wonder if there was a difference between news and opinion editing in cable television and when that broke down. Because if you watch cable television, almost all of it that is just pure opinion. It's just pure like op-ed opinion, propaganda, really. I'm curious when that broke down. I mean, definitely by 2016, but I wonder if it happened earlier. Cable news is probably the most famous for just being in your face, like, can you believe this person did that? That's disgusting. They present that as news, and that's not really news, that's opinion. Anyways, long story short, I'm really opining on this difference, but now I wonder how long that's been the case. That's an open question we at Memetic Universe will have to answer for you, dear reader and listener. So here's an explanation. One of the explanation he gives of why opinion coverage has increased says the internet rewards opinionated work, and as news editors felt increased pressure to generate page views, they began not just hiring more opinion writers, but also running their own versions of opinion essays by outside voices. Historically, the province of opinion's op-ed department. So again, there are business motivations for this as well, right? If your opinions, if your news coverage is getting less views than your opinion coverage, you are incentivized to push opinion coverage as much as you can. There's multiple forces at play. People who think, just a brief interjection, people that view like the mainstream media as a monolith, it's not. There are forces that kind of make these big information publications act in similar ways, but there are also different levels of agency, right? Like the New York Times as an institution has agency, but James Bennet, the head of the news desk, the opinion department or opinion desk, he has independent agency. And even the people in the opinion desk have individual agency. There's almost like these different levels, right? There's the individual agency, the clique level, and then the institutional level. And there can be various levels of alignment or disarray in all of that. James Bennet ends up getting pushed out of the Times to create more, what's the right word? Alignment, I guess. Basically, he doesn't think the way we want him to, says the majority of people, a dominant clique at the Times, you need to leave. these institutions that are chronically derided as being, cabals of people manipulating the public are a little more complicated than that. They have multiple people with agency fighting for control of the organization, and they're also beholden to these very powerful incentives, like economic incentives to generate as many views as possible, even if it compromises your journalistic ethics. Anyways, moving on. Yeah, so he says the creep of politics into the newsroom's journalism helped the Times beat back some of its new challengers, at least those on the left. So it helped them get more views than competitors like Vox and HuffPost, right? So when we think of the mainstream media or even the liberal media, people tend to think of them as a monolith, but you don't necessarily think about them as competing with each other for views, right? Vox, HuffPost, the New York Times, Washington Post, they're competing for the same demographic. That incentive is real and very important. Man, there's so much good stuff in here. Definitely read it. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of his, the story of his dismissal. It's I won't say entertaining, but it's kind of a gripping. He goes through in vivid detail the events leading up to and like the day of before his dismissal and the day of his when they asked him to resign. And it almost feels like an episode of like Succession. It's true corporate politics and drama. We don't need to get into that here. We're just trying to extract these big ideas about media and how the mainstream media has changed. So coming close to the end here, he ends the essay saying, if the Times were to put more trust, again, in the intelligence and decency of Americans, more Americans would again trust the Times. Journalism, like democracy, works best when people refuse to surrender to fear. So there's a lot in there that I skipped over. Maybe I'll circle back and do a more in-depth video on this with some fun editing. But the reason Memetic Universe considers this a foundational document is because it was written by a very, frankly, pissed off. You can get this tone that James Bennet is upset for being pushed out of the New York Times for following journalistic ethics. It's just like such a raw, firsthand example of someone who is deep in media, starting when when print newspapers were making gobs of money and had huge circulation. He's seen the industry totally transform. He's been in news reporting and then later in opinion reporting, and he was just on the ground in maybe one of the most, if not the most influential news organization in America, observing these events firsthand, and then he gets kicked out in this kind of, corporate coup for following journalistic ethics. It's just really good. And I may post some of my opinions in bullet point form, but if you watched until the end of the video, thank you. You are my hero. Long live Memetic Universe, and long live memeplexes of significance. I love you all. Goodbye.